record on this computer. All right, we are live. Okay, so welcome everybody to this episode of Some Days Today. I'm not sure exactly which episode this is, and if you are joining us for the first time, I'm going to let you know a little bit about what we do. If this is your you've been here before and you've been here with us and you understand that this is not some sort of professional display. What we have is, we have conversations with people. And today I am not with our main artist, our main, person who does the podcast. This is Bola. Matter of fact, when I told her I might be doing this, she said, um, we'll have to see exactly how this sounds. You might have to find your own thing. So this may not even be Some Days Today. But anyways, and you guys can hear some laughter in the background. So I am joined by some good friends. I have Zach Miller, Jed Rogers, and Shhonn Taylor. I'll give you a little bit more about how we met based on what it is that I'm trying to do and what I'm talking about. So what we're doing is I've called this discussion male bonding discussion. And so what I'm trying to do is have a conversation about how men, particularly men in America, I don't want to generalize too much about relationships in other cultures, but I know that within America, if you do any kind of Google search about men in relationships, you'll find that there are tons of articles about how difficult it is for men to have relationships. There are two comedies that have been made on this. You guys have probably seen Paul Rudd's I Love You, Man. And Kevin Hart also did a movie called The Wedding Ringer about, guys who are getting married and needing to have friends. And so that's the kind of conversation we want to have with these friends that, I've built. We've been meeting, now it's coronavirus time, we've been meeting virtually for the past 2 weeks, just discussing things. And when Zach Miller, who organized the virtual meetings, put this together, I was like, man, I was immediately kind of afraid about jumping in to this sort of thing. First of all, if you know a little about me, I'm an introvert, but also have my own individual quirks. But I thought to myself, you know what, I'm on a mission to transform and grow. This is a good opportunity to start something today. Someday was today. So I asked these guys if they would be willing to join the podcast. They said yes. And so now we are going to have a man's discussion on friendships. And so, I guess what I want to do is first, so when I talked to these guys, I sent them an article. It's a Salon article on friends. It's called Why Men Have So Much Trouble Making Friends. So if you're interested, just, Google that and see it. But I just wanted to, I'm going to start first in order of the way you guys appear to my right on this Zoom video, just to ask you what your thoughts are on the article and the phenomenon that I'm talking about. So Zach, what are your thoughts on the article and the phenomenon of, or the difficulty, at least in amongst American men, and creating and keeping relationships?
Yeah, what struck me about the article is I think it talks about men not being vulnerable enough with each other, that there are archetypes that, we're conditioned and acculturated to play and roles to fill from a really early age. And, really early, like on, you learn how to sort yourself out depending on what group you're in. And so I think it comes down to vulnerability and this idea that men, it's not manly or masculine or a trait associated with testosterone to make yourself vulnerable. And we know that real connection with other humans requires us to be real. And I think vulnerability is a key part of that. And so that's what stuck out to me when I read the article. That was like, oh yeah, like you have to be, that's the missing component a lot of times. And I think that's summed up by the anecdote about, like, men don't actually ask, like, will you be my friend? Like can we purposely be in a caring dynamic mutual dynamic. And that guys just won't even do that. So I laughed. I love early on in our relationship after you sent that email, we're like, I think Jed came on. He's like, Mack, will you be my friend?
No, I asked all three of you if you'd be my friend.
Oh, there you
So.
go. So, yeah, I thought it was a great primer, however you want to pronounce it, for our discussion. And, you know, our friendships are all fairly new in the grand scheme of our lives. We're all 40, 50 somethings. And, you know, Jed and I share a familial relationship. Jed's my brother-in-law through marriage. And I met Shhonn through Jed's relationship. And it's been a wonderful relationship getting to know Shhonn. And then Mack, you and I met through our wives' relationship. And that's kind of like how our circles all came together. And, you know, it's been probably about a year since we've been crossing circles. I think I met you, Mack, about a year ago. And it's been really fun at this point in my life to just be open to new relationships. I've always tried. My dad was one that always said, you know, you can never have too many friends in your life. Like, there's always room for another friend. It's not like a zero-sum game. And I try to live by that. Like, there's always opportunity to let more light into your life, and I see you all as being lights in my life. So I'll stop because I you know.
I just want to say for the record that Zach, you're more romantic than my wife is. So.
Well, you know, our wives shared genetic information, and so
yeah. I mean, when Zach and I tell our wives that we love them, they say that's nice.
And it's not even a joke; it's true.
That's it. That's the standard Demis family response. So.
Yeah, which I think proves that it's, you know, it's the generality is not necessarily always the case. There are differences, there are exceptions, if we can call it that. But yes, thank you for that, Zach. Shhonn, you're next, actually.
So, you know, the thing that Zach was mentioning that I found most interesting was the construct itself, right? What are the conditions under which guys make friends or guys want to be friends, right? Why is it that, you know, those guys that you grew up with, you're good friends with, and then everybody else after that, you know, after your formative years, after your high school years, after your college years, is more like work? And I think it's because the construct that most men work under is activities. There has to be some common activity, right? So you have your work friends, and you have, you know, maybe, you know, whatever you're into, whether it be cars or bowling or whatever. But that's the activity construct under which you have your friends, or biking or whatever. So I think women tend to be better at not needing a construct. First of all, they can just all end up in the same place, and that's good enough, and they'll keep in touch. Right. You know, whether they meet in the grocery store or, you know, the coffee shop, they don't have to have known each other beforehand. That's enough of a construct for them to say, hey, let's keep in touch, and they're good. Men are more, I think, or at least, and maybe I'm just thinking about myself, I think men are more, there has to be some connection on some other activity-based level to kind of create that formal foundation. I'm not saying that as an expert, I'm saying that as a question, because I try to think back to like my time in college, right? Where, you know, we were kind of forced into certain types of educational and cerebral endeavors where, okay, maybe you know, liked science fiction, or you liked, you know, learning about trees or animals or whatever it was, you know, depending on your background. And so that group might have been a little bit more cerebral. So I don't mean activity as in it's got to be a physical football kind of activity. I just mean there has to be some construct under which men come together. Otherwise, I think there might be a holdover from previous generations of training that, you know, kind of say without thought to a man in his back of his mind, hey, why are we all congregating here together if we're not actually accomplishing something? You know, and so that's the part of the whole thing that I think about is is that part of the problem? Is it that, we come from generations and generations of, if men are all hanging out together, there should be a good reason why they're hanging out. And so that we just unconsciously operate on that, or is there something else to it? So that's just the question that
Yeah,
that I spend all my time thinking about.
it's a great question. And yeah, it's interesting because it talks about a lot of these things that, a lot of the questions that you guys bring up in the article, like whether or not you, so Zach mentioned the way that we have our relationships is, whether familial or through associations with our wives, or in the case of myself and Zach, with our wives and that sort of thing. It talks about that in the article. It talks about the group relationships and the activities and that sort of thing. So this is actually a very, very good article, to start the conversation, to give you some ideas about all these different touch points. But definitely glad you guys are giving your own opinions about it from your standpoint. Now let me ask you, Jed, your thoughts on the article.
Yeah, well, I'll start off by saying that I'm also an introvert, which adds an interesting element to this whole thing. But I think one of the things that that Shhonn said about this sort of the construct is important, because I think as kids, or at least me as a kid, I wasn't thoughtful enough to think about choosing my construct, right? I was conscripted into my construct,
Right,
whether that was,
Yeah.
and that was okay, because that was like, I most of the time I enjoyed what I was doing. But the where that fails is just because you enjoy what you're doing. And for me as a kid, it was riding my bike, swimming, animals, and football. Like, I happened to be in those activities and I loved them all. But just because you love those activities doesn't mean you're naturally going to line up with the people who you're doing those activities with, right? And in some cases, that thankfully the other three were okay, but football was not a healthy place for me to be, and for a lot of reasons. I mean, physically, you make all kinds of arguments. I loved playing football, and I'm weird in a lot of ways. I don't think that's because of the head-to-head contact, but who knows? But for me, that culture, the sort of football culture growing up in Texas, in a very white place, was just an unhealthy place for me to be. I didn't line up with the values of the people that I was playing football with, mostly. I mean, there were a couple guys that if I had been smarter, I would have spent more time with, because I lined up with them. It just happened those guys were the stoners, and I didn't smoke weed. Well, I did smoke weed, but I found out that it didn't do much for me except make me fatter and make me sleep more. I was like, I'd smoke a joint, and like within 5 minutes I'd be passed out with a bag of tortilla chips on my chest or something. I was like, this doesn't work for me.
That's not a good look.
But those are the guys I identified with, and a couple of them happened to play football. And if I had been smarter, I would have figured out how to be their friend and maybe manage the weed issue somehow. But I ended up hanging out with football players who most of whom I shared no values with. And then that became a tough thing, because I began to rely on that, and it was in conflict with who I was as a person. And then when I lost that in college, after I finished playing football, there was like this void in my life for something that never really provided me with that much support anyways. It provided me with joy, like the physical joy of playing football. I loved, right? That was awesome. But it didn't provide me with a friend group that was really key to who I was. So I guess that to me is part of the focus, or one of the things I took away from the article, is how if I had been more thoughtful as a kid, I probably could have figured out how to create my own construct rather than just being thrown into something that I thought I needed to be part of. So
yeah, very, very interesting. Thank you guys for your answers. Now, there's a lot of similarity to your story, Jed, that I find within myself. So I also played football. I also feel like I was conscripted into my role, or at the very least, I like you didn't have anyone to tell me how to think about these things. And I think that's key to part of why we struggle as men. Like, I don't think when we are being raised, we are being taught to make friends. I think that there is more of a focus on women in their socializing. And maybe that's true. I don't know how true that is. And again, I'm not an expert too, but I know for there was a time when my wife and I, we were, and we talk about this in multiple different episodes, but we were going through some things, and we went to a relationship boot camp, and the psychologist who ran it had some different opinions about how, opinions based on research. And I don't know how true any of these are, but the different ways that men are as compared to women. And one of the things that he talked about understanding between ourselves is how men, for the most part, they have shame that drives them at their core vulnerabilities. And then women, they have fear. And then the fear happens to be whether it's harm, security, or isolation. And a lot of times we don't recognize how much women have that fear of isolation. And whether it's because of biology or upbringing, because I don't know how much of this he's doing in other cultures. If it is upbringing, women have that need, and they will take on shame or humiliation in order to satisfy the need of isolation. So that's why women are typically reaching out. You'll find also that, he'll talk about what happens to most men. You think that when there's a divorce, the men are the ones who are out there going and getting younger women. But what the research shows is that a lot of the times the men have no friends, they weren't building those relationships, and they die early because the women are the ones who were their connection to the world. And, because our thing is a fear of shame. And I actually do think that part of it is that we are being raised to fear failure, because, you're being told to, you have to be successful, you have to be the provider, you have to toughen up, you have to be, this and that is causing us in a lot of ways to fear going out, as it says in the article, and saying, hey, can you be my friend? Because it makes us, like Zach was talking about, have that fear of vulnerability. So I'm curious as to what you guys think about that concept of how we are being raised, and how that's affecting us in our ability to be vulnerable with one another. Anyone could jump in.
So that's an interesting perspective, and I've never really thought about it that way. I guess for me, I'm coming more from, and I fight against it. The older I get, I'm more like, these are my normative values. These are the things I'm interested in. These are, the things I do. And the need to necessarily deviate outside of that, from a cost benefit analysis, just doesn't really seem like it's that high, until you get to the point that you just made, right? Which is, okay, but if you if you end up in a situation where you don't have another conduit that's bringing socialization into your life, what are you going to do then? Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
I don't feel the same level of need to make that, to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. That's
So
okay.
I don't know what it's all about necessarily.
Let me say that that's something I shared with you as well. And there was actually, and I also talk about this during earlier episodes, but there is a point when I decided, because before I just turned 40 in July. And prior to that, one of our family friends was turning 50. And I remember going to the 50th. And if you, have relationships with Nigerians, that when they celebrate birthdays, especially the decades, they celebrate the birthdays. Like, this is like a big to-do. And so this is not something that I was familiar with, but he was turning 50, and they had people coming in from everywhere. And, the love that he was showing, I was like, oh my God, this is definitely, because prior to then I was convinced that all I needed was my wife, my children. I have my family. I don't need to go out and put myself in a position, essentially, now that I look at it, to be hurt, because I'm trying to build relationships with people. and I already have relationships that I need. And so I was like, no, you know what? I think I definitely do need that. And so when Zach, when you're talking about that, you know, having that light, this is exactly the kind of thing that I want to develop and become, because I recognize that then that that's a valuable thing. And so I say to what you just said, Shhonn, with respect to, you know, making that choice, you know, there is, I think, a lot of value, a lot of benefit to your having the, you know, multiple friends and getting, you know, the light from those friends and the happiness from those friends. And so, I guess to ask the question with respect to that, it would be, you know, I guess, you know, why do you think you would not go out? If not for fear, why do you think you would choose, you know, I don't know, for lack of a better word, to, you know, isolate yourself or not make those friends?
So let me use Jed's example, right? Because it's not so much that it's a desire to be isolated, it's just the benefit analysis. So if I use Jed's example, right, let's say that after what Jed was just saying about, you know, his interaction with folks on the football team and everything, as he went through his life, those were the only people that he kept coming in contact with. And he had like made his decision that I don't want to be like that, and I don't want to interact with those folks. Because I'm not willing to make the decision that I'm going to go with that, whatever it is, train of thought, set of activities, whatever. Then it's a matter of, as you said with women, how uncomfortable you are with that decision. And if you're not uncomfortable with that decision, then you know, tend to stick with either a smaller group or kind of going your own way. So for me, I just, I joke with some of my older friends about suffering from a good upbringing, right? Mm-hmm. I grew up in this kind of Montgomery County area where at the time I grew up, everybody was everybody, right? It's not that other things didn't exist, but but other maladies, other, you know, views, other kind of thoughts about different ethnic groups and so forth and so on. They weren't so much a part of our life here. It's not that we weren't aware of them. It's not that we didn't run into them, but the kids that I grew up with, it wasn't really a part of it. And so as I got older, folks who, you know, had a more narrow it's not even narrow all the time as much as sometimes it's just a more specific view. I'm going to be that way. You know, I like this, I don't like that. Not as eclectic of a view. Mm-hmm. We're not necessarily people who appealed to me. And so it's taken a long time for me to run into people such as, you know, the folks on this podcast who are more eclectic in their understanding and their interest, mm-hmm. you know, where I feel like that's the mix that I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. And the debate that I always have with my wife is my wife's always like, well, why don't you go out there and find them? And so to that, I always tell her, I could spend a lot of time looking for the proper mix of crazy that works for me. Or I could just be, you know, kind of like the flowers that grow on the hillside, that whole analogy. I could be happy with the fact that there are flowers and that I got to see the ones that I liked and appreciate them when I pass them. But if I just spend all my time just looking for, you know, that next special flower, then that's a lot of effort. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's something that I fight against. Let me put it that way.
I'm pretty sure Shhonn just called the rest of us special flowers. Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
All of you.
Special flower.
No, but Shhonn, you're touching upon like that box that I think a lot of guys themselves.
The man box. Yes.
Box.
I was going to ask.
We've gone from flowers to boxes. I don't know. That's going.
Flowers in a box.
Just the limits that I think men put on, you know, what it means to be a human and to be a human that is of the XY, you know, chromosome expression. There was an article, I'm going to add the article that was in the Atlantic a couple months ago. It's about raising boys. and it was about bro culture, and just how like adolescent boys these days, just some of the perils and messages that they receive early on, and a lot of the it talks a lot about the misogyny that's taught really early on about how to relate to women. And I just wanted to put out there, I think sometimes guys struggle because they haven't really been taught like the full expression of their sexuality and what it means to be a sexual human. So we don't have to explore that now totally, but I think that one of our challenges as men, you know, having testosterone, is that we do have this hormone that's like driving us, you know, some men more than others. And if you're a heterosexual male, you know, like I think you're taught the object of that desire is a woman and women. You know, if you're homosexual or pansexual or whatever, I don't know if we've ever really talked about that role. And I think guys, to your point about shame, they don't know what to do with that. And so there's a very limited expression about what's acceptable in our culture to do that. And I don't know if women, I know, you know, certainly women have a sex drive of their own, but it's different. It looks different. It's expressed differently. And I'd like to just offer that up as a potential discussion point for us to
Absolutely.
talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, but on the subject of friends and how you make them, you know, I value the friendships that I make greatly, so I don't make them lightly. And so that's another thing. To me, there is an intrinsic value to a friendship, but that also means that there's an inherent requirement to that friendship as well. And so to me, the people who I bestow that on, it also means that, you know, they kind of get that as well. And the problem is they've got to be people who deserve it. Do you see what I'm saying? And, you know, the world and people have, you know, my wife says, you're an old man. I think the world has moved away from a lot of the, you know, the morals as far as how you treat each other and individuals.
Like the personhood
that are really, kind of baked into me. And so there's a lot of people that for me on the men's side, it kind of excludes immediately because, you know, I can't really hang out with the people who yell at their wives or beat their wives. I can't, you know, like there's just certain things that are non-starters. You know, or the how people treat their children. There's a whole lot of those kind of.
Yeah. And that article I referenced, Shhonn, talks about toxic masculinity, right?
Right.
It talks about this bro culture, and that's what I mean by like, there's sometimes a limited spectrum of what, you know, that box that guys are expected to operate within, and the friends that I've made throughout my life, the people that I'm closest to, I think, to your point, Shhonn, are those that like, they're not in a box. Like they have a core understanding of the dignity and of you know, the possibilities of the fullest expressions of what's possible to be a human and even to be a man.
Yeah. Or maybe if I try to answer the question an opposite direction, because that's an interesting way of looking at it, Zach. And I just don't focus on how other people are, but I just focus on how I am. I'm not real good at going along to get along. So it means that the people I hang out with have to be people who going along with them is because they have similar values and similar traits. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. I'm just like
I don't do well with the whole, you know, drinking with the guys at the bar, because there's probably going to be things that come out that are not going to be me. And when that happens, then we're done. I mean, I'm not a let's.
It's like, oh, you had to go and say that. Like,
Shhonn, I'm just thinking about the time when we were in Austin and we were so hot, we had to go. We went into that hotel bar and then we sat and watched that blues band for like 4 hours. I think you go along, get along. You know, as long as there's air conditioning, good drinks, and good food.
I mean, So let me throw out some terms from across the times that may make my point, right? He's not a good drunk, right? Or he's got a temper, or he flies off the handle, or he's only that way with her,
Yeah.
or he's a great guy, except like I don't do well with those people where you got to make excuses for them.
The butts, yeah.
And the butt people, I don't do well with them. And so I think as I've gotten older, and it's become for my self-esteem less and less necessary, and I stick to the people who I think intrinsically are what I consider to be real men, rather than who have all of these like serious flaws, and we just kind of put up with them because that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Right. No, I'd hope, and again, not being an expert, not having done any research on what the numbers are, I'd hope that, and I know that you're just giving examples of the type of people that, you wouldn't hang out with. And so it probably is a little bit more broad than that. But I'd hope that's the kind of thing, that we're talking about, where you have, abusive people, whether physically or emotionally, or the kind of people who are, less than progressive. There are many more of those individuals, many or not that much of those individuals that we are probably not exposing ourselves to, just because we aren't necessarily making that effort. But I think there is, there's two things. First, the box thing definitely exists, and I'm wondering how much of us are living within the box, and therefore, could probably be a little bit more vulnerable with one another, and therefore find out that we are more alike than we think we are. But when we get together, for example, we have to talk sports, when maybe that's not necessarily something you want to do. And I think, as you grow older, and we're all a little bit more old, 40s and 50s, you could probably not care as much about that, right? So you can start to say, all right, this is something that I don't have to pretend to be anymore. But at the same time, you're also probably a little bit more set in your ways and isolated. So you're not making the same efforts that you were doing when you were in college and that sort of thing. And you're not in the environment to do it. You have your families and that sort of thing. And it's a lot harder to make that connection when you are more yourself. But I'm wondering, Zach, for someone who does go out and heeds your father's advice. My father is, the kind of person who was out there he has tons of friends, and, people really respect him. And it's so interesting because he does so many things that that are admirable, that I didn't get because he was always at work, and he didn't necessarily he imprinted upon me the need for education, but he didn't actually have his own personality imprinted on me because he didn't spend that much time with me. But yeah, I wonder, what do you do, and how do you, I guess, overcome, whatever it is that's holding everyone else back from doing that, and form these relationships? What would you say are some of the elements of what it takes to, create, build, maintain relationships?
I recognize that we live in a really transactional culture. So it's a lot of times it's like, what can this person do for me? Right. Especially in DC, right? Like, people are always trying to make connections, and, what can this person lead me towards? And, how can I leverage this relationship? And I really try to be conscious about, when I meet someone, I try to see them in that term. Like, I really try to understand what their motivations are. And I grew up in a Christian church, an evangelical Christian church, and a lot of the teachings are about, everyone's a child of God, right? So and that's really stuck with me while I've left the church, and a lot of those teachings still stick with me. Like, I see people as the potential, and I try to understand, what it is that they're trying to bring and live in their lives. And, unfortunately, I think a lot of people that I encounter, they're, even when people encounter me, they're going to encounter me in a state where I'm just kind of like, I'm in my process and I'm not really being vulnerable. Like I'm just going through the motions, you know, like there's so much that comes at us and it's a coping mechanism. But, you know, when I see the opportunity to connect with someone, I try to do that by just doing some of the basic things like maintaining eye contact, asking questions, showing an interest. Truly, I think I have something to learn from everybody, even the biggest jerks. Sometimes I'm just like, all right, what is it that I'm like? What is this telling me about myself? And like, why am I feeling what I feel? So I don't know. I think I try really hard to make real connections with people when, you know, to Shhonn's point, like when I'm in that space where I've made the cost benefit analysis that like, oh, this is going to be worth it to take that chance and be vulnerable.
Yeah. So let me follow up with that. And this question is for Jed. You know, you talked about, you know, finding that right fit within your friends. If you know, in college, I mean, in high school particularly, so you were hanging out with the football players, but should have hung out with you know, those who were more like the stoners. And I'm wondering, based on what Shhonn is saying, you know, this idea of being able to connect with various different types of people, if, I mean, I guess twofold, right? Maybe we weren't trying to understand, or, you know, and I say we because I feel like we all do it. I've done it. I think we all are doing it where and I think perhaps Shhonn, you're doing it, where the idea is, you know, there is a lot more depth to that person. There is an area where you could have probably connected and maybe gotten through whatever facade they were putting up and connected on a different level. But, you know, these guys were pretending to be something, whereas maybe you were pretending to be something as well. And they didn't have any idea that you were more of a stoner. And so how much of that is what we're doing where we're not taking enough of an interest and enough effort to go and find out who that true person is and how we can connect to them?
I think that's a huge part of it. I mean, I think that, you know, in general, I think the biggest barriers for me are in making friends or creating this network of people is, you know, not being intentional about it. And then, you know, closely linked to that is not making time for it. And, you know, I do think, not to go too far back in the conversation here, but I actually think what underlies all that is, you know, fear of failure or shame, or, you know, it's like you know, we're in a situation, I think, and I specifically am in a situation where, you know, my dad is a lot like yours, Mack. I mean, he's highly respected, highly educated. Everybody you ever talk to, you know, your dad's great, your dad's great. I didn't spend time with him because he was so motivated by, I think, fear of failure and shame that he was spending every moment he could building his career and doing other things. And he just, that was it. Like, that was it. And then, you know, so that was part of what I learned as a kid, is what you do, you know, as a man. And you know, I still suffer from that. It's like I think it's great to invest a lot of time and effort in being successful and avoiding failure in your professional life, your personal life, your relationships, your kids, your wife. And you can do that to the exclusion of everything else. And then it's easy to say, well, I don't have time for that. You know, I'm focused on these other things. I don't have time for that.
Right.
But it's all driven by that, you know, the fear of failure in my mind. And so I think just being intentional and making the time is a big deal, because I mean, I think a lot of people out there are willing to connect if you take those steps.
Yeah, very good. All right, so I want to also go back a little bit. You know, Zach, you mentioned the idea of sexuality, you know, the bro culture, and I think part of what differentiates the way that we behave from the way that women behave is their ability to be intimate with one another. I think there is, at least, again, you know, in our culture, this fear of, you know, this almost like homophobia, where we can't, you know, have that kind of intimacy with one another. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. And I know there, you know, Zach, you were talking about more on how we treat women, but I'm wondering if, you know, part of that also is this aggressive, this testosterone and how it creates this, potentially more aggressive sex drive, and how we're not necessarily comfortable with that feeling as it relates to our connection with men. I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think it's complex, right? I think we're touching on a couple different strands, but I'd like to address kind of like the men intimacy strand. And I think I mentioned to you guys in a previous discussion in Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, which is a biography of Abraham Lincoln, and after he won his first election, and how he kind of put together a cabinet that was, basically people that were just going at each other's throats before, and how he brought them together and really created something really dynamic and created an environment. And, I heard her talking about the book on our press tour, and she talked about how when Lincoln was a lawyer, lawyers were, they had to travel around kind of from town to town. And they would set up shop, and have court, like they would do their business, for a week at a time in different towns. And so there was a bit of a circuit, and they would stay in boarding houses. And, in these boarding houses, you shared a bed, right? Like, it wasn't like you had your own private room. It was like, no, there's a bed, it sleeps 3. Do you want slot, 1 or whatever? And they're traveling with sometimes their other lawyers and these companions. And she talked about how they would, like men would lay in bed and they would just pour out their hearts to each other and talk about really intimate things. And it wasn't a sexual relationship in that, like, that intimacy was consummated with a sexual act. It was just that there was an understanding that your wife played a certain role, and it wasn't to build up your emotional needs. Like, men sought intimate relationships with other men to meet those like longing and those needs to connect with other men. And it was more, I think, culturally acceptable for men to embrace, to walk hand in hand, to have those, just like, to cry and show vulnerability in front of other men. And I can tell you, I think I'm pretty progressive, and I have really deep, intimate connections with some of my friends, but I don't cry in front of them. Like, I don't. Like, I mean, I would, I suppose, but like,
yeah.
like, I'm not, I mean, I'm so far away from allowing myself to be that vulnerable. It blows my mind. And then I read about different contexts, and, like, that's not always been the case.
Interesting. That is very interesting. I wonder when that started to shift. And I get that. I mean, I feel like, like throughout history, whether you're talking about like, the Roman era, where, you could be sexually with men and women. And
or like the Roman soldiers would just have like a younger teenager that they were responsible for initiating sexually.
The mentor, yeah. Or the mentee.
Well, and there was a sexual component to it too.
Exactly. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder what started to shift. And I'm also finding it very interesting too, how, you guys talk about the man box and how we have this limiting, idea of what's acceptable. I always found that this was the case with me as a Black man. I think, like, for Black boys growing up, and you guys, obviously experienced the same thing, but I wondered, I thought for me that, white males could be a lot more like there was more acceptable behavior for what was acceptable. For us, it was, there was a lot of things that when I was growing up that were not acceptable. Even the way that we spoke, for example, had to be like, a certain way. And I don't know, Shhonn, if you feel the same way, but, I thought that, a lot of things that we do as men, especially when growing up, is for the affection of women. I mean, for everyone else as well, but like for women, obviously if you have, while growing up, at least in my culture, if you have the affection of many women, you would be considered of a higher status amongst your male peers as well. So, but I know that part of the issue was that even the women, and I say this to say, like, it's so all encompassing in terms of you know, the expectation on us. It's not just men on men, but women that we, you know, have interest for expect us to behave a certain way. And even mothers expect us to behave a certain way. It's just like we're being told by every aspect of society of how to behave and where our limitations are. So I don't know. I guess this is for you, Shhonn. If I don't know if you had similar experiences growing up, but that's how that's how it was for me growing up.
Yeah, you just covered a lot of ground. I think another way of saying acceptable is if we were going to use more of a pejorative, is to say what you can get away with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there definitely was a limit on what you could get away with. But you know, to put it more in a more amiable parlance, yeah. As far as acceptability, it was a very close second to quote acceptability, and that was a social normative type of thing, right? In other words, it's not so much whether it was actually right or wrong, as well as what the peer group or what the societal groups thought was okay. And so you could live one place and it could be okay, and you could go someplace else and it could be not okay, or vice versa.
Yeah.
It just depended on where you, you know, where you came up. One side of my family was, you know, from the country in Virginia, and the other one was from the city in DC. And we grew up at a time when we learned to operate in both of those worlds. And operating in both of those worlds was a culturally different thing.
Like code switching.
Yes.
Code switching is part of it. But the rationale behind it was a whole nother thing, which we could take a whole podcast to talk about. But I say that to say that it all feeds into what we're talking about today, which is what goes into how you make friends and the basis upon which you make friends. So not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but to try to maybe clarify a little bit of what I was saying earlier is, because of that, there is kind of an unstated reference I know in the back of my own mind when I make friends is this someone who has my back or not?
Yeah.
Right.
Is
And
that
that's
an element of trust?
And that it's not trust. It's whether they have your back. Okay. And the difference is that I could have acquaintances all day long, but the difference is, if I call you and I need something, do I actually have an expectation that you would come, or you would make an effort, versus you would not?
Yeah.
And that's not a gray line in my mind. It's not taking anything away from a person. It's just people are wired differently, and some people operate on that principle and some people don't. Okay. It's not a matter of, are you friends enough? It's just how that person's sense of integrity, et cetera, work. You know,
orientation of understanding of what it means to be a friend.
Yeah, I mean, when I went to school and when I went to college down in southwestern Virginia, I could tell you right now, there's a lot of people who I was friends with down there, where I'm not going to necessarily tell you that we were the strongest friends, but I can tell you that if something happened and I had to call them, they would show up. That's just how they're wired. And it had nothing to do with the fact that we were the best of friends, but it had to do with what friendship meant to them. And so and I think also, because one half of my family was from the city and one half was from the country, I got like this, what I view, which may not be the correct vernacular to use, kind of this from the country, very grounded kind of view of friendship, as well as an understanding of what I consider to be more of the city understanding of friendship, which is more of what Zach was describing about what people who are like, well, what is our mutually beneficial reason for being friends, versus what I experienced with more of the rural roots where it was more of no. I mean, we either are or we aren't. And if we are, it's whatever you need that I can provide. And I can't always provide it, but if you call, I'm going to try to do what I can, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that spun a yarn that totally confused everybody, but
no. I think for me, what it highlights is, that we have different definitions of friends, obviously. So part of what I was thinking about when you were saying this is, like, I know that there are a lot of women, for example, who have friends who they also feel like they've been betrayed in one way or another with that person, but they still maintain that friendship.
correct.
Quote unquote. And so, and I know, for example, like Bola and I, Bola, you would never know Bola was an introvert, but we are essentially each other's best friends. Like, we have similar history in that, like, when we were growing up, you throughout, like, the various different school years, I can point out to you that one friend that I had, because all I needed was that one friend. I don't go out and find too many others, but part of the reason that I think we do that is because we identified someone who we felt, just like you said, Shhonn, was gonna have your back. Like, this person had your back, and with whatever it is that you do. And I wonder about two things with respect to that. One of the things with respect to that friend is not that only that they had our back, but that they click. So it's the same thing that we were talking about, like we click rather. So it's the same thing that we were talking about earlier with how do you formulate relationships with people who are not necessarily a lot like you. So I think that's one question about that, about what friendship is, because you could have somebody you click with, like, you vibe, everything works, you talk about the same things, your interests are the same, but maybe that person doesn't have your back necessarily. If you need to call on them, they're not necessarily going to come. Then maybe you, like, because of the culture or the upbringing of that person, you may not ever have a need to call them because you don't hang out in the same places, but that person in their character would come to your aid if you ask. And so I'm wondering, I guess, how you reconcile the two when you're thinking about friendship.
Yeah. So let me put it this way, right? And it's kind of like chitlins and chewing gum, right? I don't. It's not so much what you look like, what you're into, or what you're about. It's about the moral fiber. And as I've gotten older, I've had to just admit that really is the thing for me that matters the most, right? I mean, I've got friends who like comic books and friends who like guns and, friends who, like, taking computers apart, and engineers that all they can do is, talk about building structure. It's not what they do or are into or that kind of thing that matters to me. It's the type of person they are and how they treat other people. And that's kind of the factor that matters to me. So when I talk about if they have your back or not, I don't necessarily mean that that's somebody who's going to stand and fight on your behalf, as much as I just mean if you call them up, they're going to pick up the phone, as opposed to telling you 3 weeks later, oh, I saw you called 3 weeks ago.
Right.
What'd you want? It's like, well,
right.
If I called 3 weeks ago, I wanted to talk to you 3 weeks ago. I didn't want you to call me back and tell me 3 weeks later that you got my call, right? Yeah. Some people that's to them, that's their idea of friendship, right? Is it's self-ingratiating to feel that they are in contact with multiple people at any given time, and that somehow creates a standard for friendship. Mm-hmm. I'd rather have 2 people that I know I can count on than have 200 that are not going to take my call.
Right.
So you're right. I mean, it depends on what your idea of friendship is. Now, saying that, I don't want to give the wrong impression. My wife also says I could talk to a rock. I don't dislike people. In fact, I'm an extrovert. I mean, no two ways about it. I am definitely an extrovert. And we'll go to functions or go to affairs, and I can tell you everything about everybody I met. And then my wife will say, "Oh, that sounds like you guys hit it off. Did you get their number?" And I'll be like, "No." And she's like, "Well, if you know all that, why'd you get their number?" And I'm like, you know, because because that part of it doesn't occur to me as readily.
Mm-hmm.
But I am interested in people. I am fascinated about where they come from and you know, their lives and what they do. Because this is going to sound weird, but in the same way that Zach was saying that he believes in the innate value of everyone, that's something that I share as well, right? Is that you can always learn from somebody else. There's always something you can learn from a new and different perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's just me.
I just wanted to throw that question out to, you know, each Zach and Jed. You know, what's your definition of friendship? And yeah, just that. What's your definition of friendship?
I'm just making a note right now. Answer Shhonn's texts in less than 3 weeks. So.
Keep it under 3 weeks.
I got 3 weeks to answer your text. Now I know. Now I know what the.
You know, it's funny because the interesting thing about this conversation is the things that dawn on me, right? Because I don't walk around asking myself these questions. And so it's only when the question is posed that I really think about it, right? Like I have a friend, for example, that, I mean, I have known through jobs and everything else for more than 2 decades. And we've kind of fallen off because of that very issue that I just talked about, right? Which is, you know, you send them messages and you'll be like, "Hey, what's going on?" Send them voicemail, stuff like that. And then, you know, 3 months later, when they get interested, they're like, "Hey, how you been? I haven't heard from you." It's like, no, actually, you haven't responded back to me. And then they're like, "Oh, I didn't know that was going on with you. You almost died." Like, well, you didn't know because you don't keep in touch. So,
But see, the thing is, just before you guys answer that, because I wanted to say what I would, and this is the same thing with my family. And again, like I am trying to be better in the next 10 years. I hope, you know, you guys are showing up for my 50th.
Is your goal to have a 50th? Like
yes, you're there. All of you are there. Okay, that's definitely the goal. Definitely, it's gonna happen huge.
I like it. I like it.
But I know, like, this is something, and I have to do a much better job. Like my mother, my father, everyone that I am really close with, they do not hear from me. And but you call me up. If you call me up and, you know, you're texting whatever, it's like, "Hey, I just want to say what's up." You're not going to hear from me. If you call me up and say, "I need ABC," then that's when I spring to action. Because for whatever reason, my thing is, I didn't want to be having like these, "Hey, how's it going?" and like what I consider awkward conversations where, that's why, you know, I'm maybe a little older, but I prefer text because it's like really quick. I tell you exactly what I need, and then
but see, that counts. But to me, that counts, right?
I gotta say,
you
my best friend who's from college, who I stay in touch with, he's a really interesting guy. He gambles for a living. I could tell you all about him next time we get together, but he and I, we've known each other for, I don't know, 30 years, 40, almost 40 years. And for a long time, we got in this habit of, before text was a thing, we would call each other and it was okay to say, "Hey man, this is just an FMC." And FMC is friend maintenance call.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the message to say, if you're busy, you just say, "Hey man, thanks. I'll talk to you again soon." And but if you had time to talk, you talked, right? So it's like, we had this norm. It was like, "Hey, we want to stay in touch, but we know we're all, we got other stuff to do. He's got to go place a bet. I got to go take care of an animal, whatever it might be." So,
but see, that's what I'm saying. It wasn't that he called and then you thought to yourself, "Oh wow, 3 months ago, I should have probably gotten back." You at least said something, even if it was just, "Hey, got your message."
True.
The difference.
Yeah.
The other curve that I want to throw you, Mac, because I don't know if you've thought about it this way, because again, I'm coming from one culture, we're all coming from different cultures. Is I come from a very large extended family, And one of the side effects I've learned as I've gotten older of that is it's not necessary for you to have direct communications, to have complete communications when you're part of a large extended family, right?
What do you mean
So
by that?
I know some of the guys have heard this before, but I'm just going to give you the math real quick, right? So my great grandmother on my mother's side, I'm sorry, my great grandmother on my father's side, okay? She immigrated up to DC from Lynchburg, okay? And she was able to bring up her sister, okay? And her sister had children. So because my grandmother brought up her sister, my great grandmother brought up her sister and helped her sister bring up her children, all of those family members have always been very tight knit. And so my father had 26 first cousins because of the number of children they had, which means that at my level, there's somewhere over 100 that live in the DC area.
Wow.
You literally can't throw a stone without hitting one of them.
Wow.
Okay. And so up until those two matriarchs passed away, which was in the like 80s, okay, everyone had to show up at church at least once a month. Nobody cared whether you were religious or not. You were going through those doors, okay? Because one of those two matriarchs expected to see you, right? So the way the family network was even though I may not have talked to you as a first cousin, my mother would talk to your aunt or your mother who talked to et cetera, et cetera. And so the news was still traveling. Do you see what I'm saying? So everybody might get together for like reunions or a Redskins Cowboy game or something like that, but everybody wasn't talking to everybody all the time.
Right.
But that network of women, for lack of a better way of saying it, was so strong. And then the auxiliary relationships of the men and women who worked together, the men and women who were on different community groups, was enough to keep the entire communications network kind of going, where just because person A didn't talk to person B, it didn't mean that you didn't know everything there was to know about their life. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so it took me a fair amount of time up into my 30s as people started passing away to realize that this isn't how the rest of the world works. You have to have more direct communication. And so I do know that that is probably part of what I suffer from, because even on my mother's side of the family, that's, that was from the country, right? My mother was one of 6 children, right? And so still, if you go near one of them, they're going to tell you about your entire life because they've been talking to my mother or they've been talking to whoever, right? And on my father's side, it was the same way. You pass a cousin in the street and they're like, oh yeah, you're Rose's grandchild. Didn't you just get a job at X or go to Y, or didn't your daughter just go to college? And you're like, how do they know that? I haven't talked to this person in like 16 years. But that's the currency that the older echelon of the network traffics in. And so they talk to each other all the time. And so in that way, they kind of created this virtual, for lack of a better way of saying it, community that tied us all together. And so as more and more of those upper echelons pass away, then more direct communication is required than was before, right?
Yeah. And as you say that, what I'm thinking, and we talked about this briefly last 2 weeks ago when I mentioned, was it 2 weeks ago? Or was it a week ago that we talked? A week ago. So we talked about how the way that society is structured now. You don't live in one place. Like we're constantly moving from place to place. Whereas back in the days, someone would live in a town their entire lives. They would work in that same town. They would be raised in that town and work in that same town. They would know the same people in that town. And it sounds to me a lot like what your family dynamic is. And so since we're constantly moving, it makes it a lot harder to build and maintain those sorts of relationships, and it requires a little bit more effort. It can't be that virtual where,
Well,
you know, the town gossip is happening.
so the one small correction in your thought process on that. So
Mhm.
it's not so much that, it's that you've gotten used to it, and so you expect the telephone chain to kind of work the same way. So let me give you an example, right? I've got a cousin who is basically my brother, my father's brother's child, right? And we're 13 weeks apart, right?
Okay.
Now, all these other cousins I'm telling you about, they're, you know, first cousin, second cousin, third cousin removed, but this is my actual cousin, and we literally were raised together, right?
Mm-hmm.
He lives in Florida, right? If my mother says I was trying to talk to XYZ that's on his side of the family, who's up here in DC, I don't immediately think of who I'm going to call in DC, who probably lives on the next block from them.
Mm-hmm.
I call to Florida and I say, where's XYZ? Because I know that I work my side of the chain, he works his side of the chain. That's, I mean, that's just a part of the culture that I grew up with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And even in Florida, he will know where all his people are and what's going on with them, just like I would know where all my people are and what's going on, you know, with them.
Yeah.
You know, like a silly but simple example, right? Because this has happened a number of times, right? My mother would call me and she'd say, I think I saw your other cousin's brother, you know, going across Capitol Hill. And she's like, was that him? And I'm like, I don't know, Mom.
I wasn't there.
She's like, I wasn't there. She's like, I'm pretty sure it looked like him. And so I would call my cousin down in Florida and I would say, was your brother on Capitol Hill today? And he'd say, oh yeah, you know, he works over in Southeast and that's the way he goes home. So yeah, she probably did see it. Was he driving this kind of car? Yeah, that's probably him. Mm-hmm. Right. But that's the network that I grew up being able to rely on.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm at HHS. I've got cousins at NIH. I've got ones at Commerce. I've got ones at this, that, and the other. Mm-hmm. You know, if I need to know something, then I just call one of them and they're like, oh no, you want to know something about Treasury? Oh no, that's the other cousin. Let me call them. You know what I'm saying? But it's not like I ever had to call that person. Mm-hmm. I would talk to the person I talked to who would talk to the person they talked to, kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Very interesting.
I know it's a construct that's probably communications construct that's kind of going by the wayside now because families aren't like that anymore. But
yeah.
It's interesting, and I guess the thing that I will close that chain of thought just to make all of you smile is because it is a true story. Literally, last year, I went to the funeral of a lady that I swear to you I have worked with for 12 years. When I came in the agency, this was one of the ladies who took my hand and was like, this is how you're going to do it. And this is what you need to know about the organization, all this kind of stuff. Right. Mm-hmm. Known this woman from the day I entered this job. Right. And she passed away. And so I went to her funeral and I walk in with all my work colleagues and I look at the family side and there is 12 of my cousins sitting there. Mm-hmm. And they're looking at me like, well, why are you sitting over there? So, of course, I know better than to sit over there, even though I don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I go and I sit with them. So now all my work colleagues are like, what? Right? And so, you know, at that point I lean over and I'm like, so I'm assuming we're related to, they're like, of course we're related. That's Sissy's cousins, da-da-da-da-da, right? So it turns out I never, ever knew that this woman was related to me because her father had passed away when she was a teenager. And since her father was the member of our family, then the part of the family that was, you know, brother and sister with him, they kept up with her family, but they didn't really come to the reunions. They didn't really come to the same church. They didn't really do all those other things. So the nucleus that would have normally have been much larger, which would have allowed me to understand that she was related to me, that wasn't active because the member of the tree that would have made that happen had passed away when she was a teenager.
Mm.
But all the other ones that I talk to on a regular basis, they're like, oh yeah, they're your cousin, they're right there. But
yeah,
I think that's part of my personal thing about how I make connections, is that I've always been able to rely on that. I mean, in that particular case, literally, a pastor in my family actually did the sermon at this funeral. The people singing were people who were directly in my family. This was not somebody who was just kind of like tangentially, partially second removed part of my family. This woman actually was in my family, and I never knew it. And I worked side by side with her like for 20 years. I mean, not 20 years, for 10 years.
Wow. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, definitely different than my experience. But let me ask you guys, because I didn't get the answer from Jed and Matt and Zach on this. Your definitions of what a friend is, and I'll give mine too.
Yeah, Mac, go for it.
Oh, you want me to go first? Because I was reserving the right as the host to like steal all your information.
I'll go. So, yeah, I mean, I think for me, I have a very fluid definition of friend. I mean, I like that example I gave my best friend from college. I'm still in touch with him, and I still consider him one of my best friends, but I rarely get a chance to talk to him. So there's people like that in my history that stay friends forever, just because I've shared something with them that was a little bit deeper. I shared some intimacy or some deeper stuff with them, and that's just kind of makes you a friend for life, no matter how much you stay in touch. But to me, I think there's all different levels of friends, and I don't have a strict definition for how that goes. I think it's very fluid, and I think it can change over time. And this kind of ties together with that what I mentioned earlier about the lack of intention, which I think bites you in the ass, because it's without the intention and the time, it's just kind of floating. So I think I have a very loose definition of what a friend can be, and it can change over time, and it can be all kinds of different levels. But to me, there's no here's the bar that you have to pass to be my friend.
Yeah. Cool. Zach?
I like that. I'll go with Jed's definition there. I'm trying to think like the long-term friendships I have in my life, and the friends that I have now. And yeah, there is an intentionality to it. And I'd also like to say that in some way they found a way, just as I talked about trying to connect with other people, I think the people that I really truly feel a kinship of that friendship with are people that have tried to reach out and see me as well. And it's not just like, oh, this guy's, whatever, like, oh, it's not transactional. It's they've actually, like, for whatever reason, they're at a place in their life that they see me, and they find a way to signal that to me.
Agreed.
That's friendship to me. And to Jed's point too, and Shhonn's point, like, there are different friends, and I'm not really interested in maintaining something that's work. It's like, if there's sometimes you just know, like when someone's not going to make a request of you that's not a legit request, right? Like, if so-and-so's calling on you, like, yeah, like I'm dropping my stuff and I'll be right there. And at this point in my life, I really kind of know the difference, I think, in my interactions with people.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if I'm going to go, I think I would put myself on the opposite side of that. Like, I because I'm questioning everything now, because I'm going on this journey now, I don't know precisely who I would consider a friend anymore, because I feel like a lot of the reason, I mean, obviously part of the reason I'm doing this is, or not obviously, I don't know how obviously, rather, the reason I'm doing this is because I feel like I want to build and start creating new relationships and start forming new bonds and creating friendships. And so I think, that definition is still being formed. But I can say that, one of the only friends that I have now that is not my wife, or family relations, is this friend that I had since high school. And, he lives in Silver Spring, not too far from here. And, every New Year, our family spends, time together, and we've known each other since forever. But he is, one of those guys, I think he was a lot like you, Zach, in a sense that he forms relationships. Like he has, and, I would definitely want to make sure I give him a shout out here, because he's brought up, this article about how difficult it is to bring friends. He's pulled people together for one thing or another, so that, and by people I mean men actually, like doing investment clubs and that sort of thing. And so, he does a really good job of it. And I think, part of the issue that I have probably, also, and I don't know if this is just peculiar to me and people like myself, is that I'm very sensitive. And so when you talk about, needing somebody to have your back, or, or seeing potential slights, and me saying, okay, this person's not my friend anymore, I wonder how much of that is truly just me, and how much of that I need to change within myself. And so, again, I'm just continuing to question. But yeah, this friend Mike Idiokitas, who I'm gonna definitely have on one of the episodes, he doesn't take himself too seriously, and I think that's precisely what allowed me to continue to be, his friend. And he's not going to take any offense to anything. He's not going to take offense to me not reaching out and that sort of thing. And so we remained friends throughout. He traveled with me, and when I turned 40, him and his wife, and so we remained great friends. And so, I guess for me on this journey to grow and form relationships, I'm still trying to define precisely what that is. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna start to create lines that don't exist yet. But yeah. Okay, well, so the thing is, we are now at about 7:25, and I don't like to do this for more than an hour, precisely because I don't want to do too much editing. I like the idea of the conversation flowing and not having to cut it back because it's too long, and I don't want to subject my listeners to anything that's too long. And so I think this was good. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I appreciate you guys for being on the inaugural, I'm not gonna say podcast, but this part of the podcast.
We have to see if we make the cut for Bola.
I know, right?
I think we're gonna all end up on the floor, personally.
We'll see what happens here. Well, we'll see. I think it's pretty good. I think her audience will like it. This is, I think, in line with the idea of just jumping in and doing it, which is what the podcast is about. Jump in and do it. So I think it'll work. Cool. But any last words for anyone before I close out? And you'll probably like my the way we close out. But any last words before I do that?
Just a note of gratitude for you, Mack, for making yourself vulnerable with us. And I see you, and it's really, thank you for sharing of yourself with us, or at least with me. I don't want to speak for Jed and Shhonn, but I'm pretty sure they share the same sentiment.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that I already checked with Susie, and the house is available for your 50th, so we can have a couple hundred of your best friends over here. So.
It's already 10 years in advance. I'm already planning it. It's all good. Love it.
Yeah, it's very thought provoking. I appreciate it, Mack, and look forward to some happy hours where we kind of extend the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Jed and Shhonn, as well. Like this is really. Just another glimpse into your lives, and helps me understand who you are too. So appreciate your friendships.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you guys. And thank you all for listening to this episode of Sundays Today, where we encourage you to live your life like it's a fucking vacation. All right, guys.
All right.
All right.
Yeah.
Talk to you next
See you
week.
later.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Peace.